You're listening to The Tension. We have conversations about the challenges facing leading financial advisors and how you can manage them. We don't have all the answers, but the work advisors do matters. And if we want to change lives, we've got to be intentional. Welcome to The Tension. Welcome to The Tension. Today we're talking with Sean Johnson about how to become a trusted advisor and the tensions that advisors have to manage as a part of that. My name is Dan Wanous. I'm joined by my co-host Luke Winskowski and our guest, Sean Johnson, CEO of Madison. Sean, some of our listeners may know who you are. Many may not. Why don't you give a brief intro on who you are? I know I said you're the CEO of Madison, but even that is a recent title for you, an endeavor for you. Give us a little bit of background on who you are and what you're bringing to the conversation.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. Very much looking forward to doing this. Looking forward to learning from you all. So my name is Sean. Right now, I'm the CEO of Madison. Madison started in January of this year. So like you said, pretty recent. Prior to that, I spent 12 years as one of the founding partners at a firm called Manifold, which was we called it a venture holding company. It was sort of a weird Frankenstein of we had a product development shop that moved upstream to enterprise, became innovation consultants. And then we had an early stage fund. So it made more sense earlier when we were working with founders on both sides. As we moved up to enterprise, it got weirder. But I spent the majority of my time on the advisory side of the business there. We were around 70 folks or so when I left in 2022. I spent 9 years teaching digital marketing at Northwestern University at Kellogg. In 2022, I stepped away from the business. Realized kind of where my partners wanted to go and where I wanted to go were kind of different things. Spent about 18 months kind of thinking about what does that mean for me? I was very fortunate to be in a position to be able to do that. But kind of emerged from that, realizing kind of what I want to be when I grow up. And Madison kind of came out of that. And really, Madison is a marketing firm for professional services, and it's informed largely on, or at least in the beginning, it was informed heavily on my learnings from the Manifold experience. So at the tail end of my time there, we started bringing in some managing directors from like BCG, PwC, that kind of thing, and wanted to kind of move away or expand beyond just the founder-led sale to kind of have a proper kind of managing director layer there. And I naively thought that they did their own marketing, their own thought leadership, and that wasn't true at all. And so I had to spend a couple of years trying to kind of stand that up for them, and made almost every mistake that one could make. In the beginning, we were either borrowing from like the big consulting firm playbook of, white papers and long form blog posts, and, which for us was not effective. And I can go into reasons why, or like the B2B SaaS playbook from Ventureland of, lots of kind of cold outbound or trying to run paid ads or all those kinds of things. And I realized eventually that professional services kind of requires a different playbook. And so the rest of that time was kind of around figuring out what that playbook is, and eventually kind of honed in on some stuff that worked, and took that and asked myself, do other boutique firms have this issue? And it turned out they basically all do. And so Madison is kind of designed to solve that. And the three things specifically that we spend most of our time on are helping them get clarity on who they serve, showing up consistently and helpfully through what we call authority marketing, and then creating respectful ways for people to raise their hands when they're ready. So that is me in a nutshell.
Well, thanks for that background. I want to dive in before we go through kind of those three categories that you talked about. One of the things that I think would be really resonant as I've talked to advisors, there's this sense of, hey, I got into this business because I really want to serve people. And I hear that over and over and over, like this deep sense of service, calling, like this is a noble profession. They get to see the impact that they have on clients' lives. But then when they go out to actually try to find new clients, there can be this kind of, I don't want to feel smarmy. I don't want to feel salesy. I don't want to feel like I'm, imposing myself on prospects. How have you seen advisors do that, or professional services firms do that really well and really authentically?
Yeah. So, the basic idea that we talk about over and over again is, and I think you hinted at this, is that people buy professional service. It's a trust-based sale. So you're basically buying a person, or you're buying a person's brain. You're not buying a product. You're not buying a good. And so it's very intangible, and it's hard to see what it's going to be until you actually work with them. And so there's a lot of angst around that and risk around that. And so it is a very trust-based sale. And so for most firms, the way they get the bulk of their business is through referral, understandably. And they're basically drafting off of the trust of a friend or a colleague or whomever. And so one of the kind of the early insights for us was that whatever it is that we do needs to be executed in such a way that it conveys trust, builds trust, and there's a lot of implications around that. So, like you mentioned, like I do think that there's nuance. I do think there is a place for outbound, for example. I do think that can be a strategy. The way that a lot of people do it, I don't think is particularly effective. I'm sure you probably get hit up weekly with the DMs about like, would you like 5 to 15 appointments, on autopilot or whatever it is. We tried to run that playbook a couple times in Manifold days, and we saw what everybody else sees, which is, it's a 25-year-old building a lead list and then just kind of carpet bombing people 5 or 10 times in like a 21-day period of time. And that is not whatever that is, it is not a recipe for trust building. And so for the 2% hit rate that you get, which isn't even business, it's just like getting a call, 98%, you're kind of upsetting. And in our world, our audience was relatively small. So it was chief innovation officers, heads of innovation at, pretty large companies. And so you can churn through a list like that very, very quickly. And again, for the 2% that we were getting on the phone or getting an initial meeting with, I felt like we were kind of doing long-term brand damage for the other 98%, where they're, to the degree that they remember it at all, they're going to remember us negatively. And so we were like, we can't play this game. What game can we play? And that's kind of what led us to, what I call authority marketing, which is, and right now it's 2024, it's largely LinkedIn. And I just think that's because it allows us to kind of show up in a way that gets in front of you. That's all just about adding value and trying to serve. To your point, it's not a sales pitch. We're not trying to be influencers. I tell our clients, like, we try to make them slightly famous. Like, we're just trying to get them well known with the people that they seek to serve. And that's all that matters. And we're not trying to do engagement bait. We're not doing any, I proposed to my fiance last week, here are 5 lessons about B2B sales. Like, it's all about service, and it's all about packing as much value as I can into each piece of content that we create, and trusting that if I do that enough, I'll earn a follow relationship with somebody. And then over time, they see my little face and my little headline over and over, and they're like, that's interesting, that's interesting, that's interesting. I'm making these little deposits. And then eventually, like, you know what, we should talk. And then they pick up the phone and they, or book an appointment or whatever that looks like. It is not a recipe for, I got to hit my quota in 30 days. It requires a long-term view. But I think it's effective. And I think that it accomplishes that goal, like you said, of building trust in a more scalable, more predictable way than just kind of relying on referral alone.
That only works. And now I'll go back to what you talked about around finding your ideal client profile. That only works if you actually really have a strong sense for, I'm not writing this for everyone. I'm not trying to be an influencer. I'm not trying to have millions of views. There is a specific population that we are really well set up to serve and want to serve. How, if you were an advisor, how would you start thinking through how to do that really well?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this. I can tell you what I've seen with some of other industries. So, I've done a fair amount of work for attorneys. I've done a fair amount of work for like software development firms, things like that. And I see this with software all the time, is they go in thinking that they basically are selling a set of skills. So we are React Native developers or whatever it is. They basically are selling, we're people that do stuff for you. And then you're like, what kind of stuff? And you're like, well, what do you want? And it's like, it's not a good way to sell. And I learned this lesson the hard way at Manifold because we had an allergy to focus. We wanted to serve all industries kind of at all times. And to your point, it makes it really hard to speak directly to that person. So like me in my current life and on behalf of my clients as well, my goal is, I call it like 202 kind of content. So there's like 101, like, financial planning for dummies, or whatever the equivalent would be. I like the 202 stuff, the stuff that somebody who is my ideal buyer would read it and be like, yes, like that I've that is the exact problem that I am dealing with, or that I recently was dealing with, or whatever. Something that signals that you've been there 50 times, 100 times, 500 times, whatever it is, that that movie and you know how it is going to unfold. That's the kind of stuff, that's what I shoot for. It's harder in certain industries than others, but I try to shoot for that. And to the degree that you can get specific, I think that makes that so much easier to do. The degree to which you have specificity, it narrows the range of problems, the problem set that your potential client is dealing with, and it increases the likelihood that you have seen that movie before. Whereas like when I was selling innovation consulting, it was like, here I'm going to have a meeting with a financial services company, and the next day I'm going to go into publishing, and then the next day I'm going to go talk to Xerox, and the next day I'm going to go talk to, Clorox or whatever. Really, really hard to come in and confidently and competently demonstrate, expertise and knowledge that way. And so, again, a lesson learned kind of the hard way, but I would imagine that there's probably some geographic concentration that a lot of financial advisors have just by virtue of their network and all that kind of thing. It's not obvious to me that that a lot of that needs to be necessarily geographically constrained anymore. And so when you're operating in a world where you can tap into a platform like LinkedIn or whatever, where you have a national audience or even an international audience, you could be, the financial planner for early stage founders or whatever it is. And there's a lot of those out there. And, like the early stage founder has some very specific needs, like qualified small business stock is something that's hyper relevant to them. That's probably not relevant to almost anybody else. And so like, that would be an example of like, it allows you to speak really, really clearly about their specific needs. And there are still more than enough of those people out there to build a great business, in my opinion. So.
Yeah, it's interesting if I could chime in. So what we experience, or at least what I've experienced over my career, is the idea that advisors who really do focus in on what their core niche they're speaking to is as you said, very helpful to them. But where advisors struggle is that a lot of the, I would say, attractive prospective clients are people at times that aren't within their sphere. They're speaking to people that aren't like them. And, because it's a trust-based business, we want to see a lot of authenticity. So at 49, where I work and lead as president, the organization, one of our core values is authenticity. And we bring in a lot of young adults who are wildly talented, and we're asking them to speak to two audiences. Audience number one is other people like them, because we think there's a lot of attraction of those types of individuals to people like them. But then there's another layer to that, which is speaking to people that in some cases are generationally 2 tiers away from them, in a different age set. And to be able to do that with authenticity, but also specificity, can be challenging. And the other thing that you said that I was really resonant was this idea of what is their role then, or any advisor's role in speaking to that group. So I'd be curious to hear in your work any examples or any ideas of how a person might bring that, I think you call it authority marketing, to their own practice and their projection of their authentic self to the communities they're trying to reach.
Yeah. So in a lot of firms, the model has been osmosis and just sort of sit at the feet of the partner and just sort of learn passively, which can work. It's just inefficient. And so what they've been doing is kind of trying to take these ideas, and the nice thing about some of this stuff is that the disadvantages that they might have in terms of they're not a gray hair with 30 years experience. One advantage is that they're a digital native. And so they understand the platform natively, and they maybe have fewer hangups around kind of putting themselves out there a little bit, or at least like they get it. Like they don't have to be convinced about why that would be a good idea. And, I've seen examples. So a real concrete one. We hired a guy right out of college as an associate on the fund side of the business. And he was doing diligence on deals and all that kind of thing. We had a channel in our Slack called Worth Reading, and he was routinely sharing just really interesting stuff. So third-party stuff. They're not his ideas. They're just interesting articles that other really, really smart people have written. And he was adding like a couple sentences of commentary about how that applies to our business or whatever. And I remember it took 3 or 4 sessions, like one-on-ones with him, but I was like, man, like you need to turn this into a newsletter or something like that. This is really good stuff. I think other people would benefit from it. And finally he did. And long story short, like you fast forward, like I think it was like 9 months or something like that. And the subscribers that he had, the caliber of VC that he had, they were much bigger deals than I was, certainly. Some of the more, for anybody that's kind of familiar with venture land, like some very well-known names. And he ended up getting poached, unfortunately, by one of those firms. But it kind of proved the point of his version of that was not going out with all of his own kind of original thinking. It was more of a curator strategy where he is drafting off of the intelligence of other people. Those could be internal people. Those could also be third parties. And it's just more of like, hey, this is interesting. Thought you might find that interesting too, or whatever. Another approach I've seen, I don't know if this would work as well in financial services, but is like the build in public kind of approach where it's like, hey, I'm in this new role. I'm learning. But I'm going to share with you what I'm learning as I go along and like what I'm discovering. And people really like that, to your point around authenticity. They like to go along for the journey. They like to support you kind of in your journey. And it's a way, again, for you to kind of go out there with a little bit of humility that's not saying like, hey, I know a bunch of stuff that I don't necessarily know, but I'm learning and I'm going to share with you kind of as I go. So.
Yeah, I love that. I think, we teach advisors to be interesting. And when you think about human psychology, they're attracted to a really good story. They like a story that has an interesting beginning, a complication, and some sort of a resolution. And so we try to get our advisors to think about, how are you the resolution?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this idea that, for example, interesting story, one day long ago, there came this thing called a Great Recession, and everybody lost a lot of money. And they got really upset about it. And some people actually had to wait to retire. And that was not their dream. It was not their plan. I actually, I'm acting as if I'm a younger person. I actually didn't live through that, but I've heard people my folks have gone through that. And during the last 10, almost 15 years, the whole story has been like, markets are going up. Everything's going great. Yet, I think that we all have history to show us that there's going to be another complication to this story. And I'm really trying to figure out, how do I be relevant in that for the people I care about?
Mm.
So I'm going to share ideas, tips, thoughts around how you plan around that, because I think it's coming. I'm not trying to be dire, but that's a part of our responsibility as a planner, is to actually anticipate these types of events and put a plan in place so that we're going to be okay. So that we can actually achieve the things we really care about.
Yeah.
So that's an example, I think, and it plays. You really sparked my thinking around, this idea of storytelling and engaging people, because then you're inviting them to be a part of that story with you, as opposed to having you say that we're curated, like an arbitrary thought. That arbitrary thoughts are fine, but they don't get much attention until the person you actually want to see as a part of that really tunes in. I mean. Am I tracking where you're going, generally speaking?
Yeah, I think so. And I think to your point around story, the other nice thing about story is like it's a little bit more humble, to your point. Like it's I think I've heard it put, it's like saying, it's not saying this is what you should do. It's like saying, this is what I've done, or this is what I've seen. And you can't argue with that. Like, it's like, well, what are we debating? It's like, here was client A. here was client A before, here was client A after. This happened. Like, so I'm not saying this is universally true in all situations and all times. All I'm doing is telling you a story. And people, one, remember stories better than they remember data. Two, there's nothing to object with because it's part of my lived experience. So like, what are we arguing about? And then three, I do think it's a way of demonstrating for people as they gain experience, especially, it's a way to demonstrate competence and knowledge and experience without saying, look how smart I am, just by virtue of telling a story. And like, there's a before, and like you said, like there's a before and an after, and look at this amazing thing that happened. And I even run into that, you know, like I try to be, you know, obviously I have opinions, from what I've experienced. Almost everything I talk about, is this is stuff that we tried, and this is what worked, and this is what didn't work. You know, that you might have found the complete opposite. I'd love to hear about that. You know, like one example is like with organic search. So we started off writing long form blog posts, writing white papers, because that's what we saw the Deloitte Digitals of the world doing, and we thought that's what we should do too. And we learned really quickly the only people that see that are people who already know us. Like, it implied that people were coming to our site, which they weren't. And so it was like, and we were not going to be able to compete with them from an organic search standpoint. And even if we could, there wasn't enough volume to make, again, like the chief innovation officer at Xerox isn't typing in phrases in Google to try to find people like us. And so that was what led us to LinkedIn, because we were like, well, where can we play? And we realized all of our managing directors had their 100 or 500 or 1,000 or whatever it is followers. And, you know, it's an algorithm. So a subset of that audience sees it at any given time. And it's a function of how much they've engaged with you in the past, blah, blah. But even 30%, let's say you have 100 followers and 30% see any given post. And let's say we're writing 10 to 15 posts a month. I'd rather get 30% of your 100 followers than 100% of zero, which is what I was getting on with the organic search strategy. So it's like, that's a personal story. I'm sure there are people who have crushed it from an organic search perspective in professional services. And they would disagree with me about that. And I want to learn from them. I want to learn, like, how did it work for you? What did you run into? This is something I've seen. But when I tell that story, usually people are nodding their heads because they like see that, they see themselves in that story, and they're like, yeah, we've been writing all these blog posts and like, no one comes to our site. You know, like, it's like, so I'm not telling them what they should do. I'm just telling them about my experience and like how candidly I screwed up. And it took me a lot longer than I had wanted to like figure it out, but I finally figured it out, or figured out something that worked for us, you know? So it's just it is a more authentic, I think a slightly humbler way of kind of showing up in the world while still demonstrating kind of credibility and building trust.
It also strikes me in that example that, Luke, the example you used, the kid, so to speak, that was, hey, they were in elementary school maybe when the financial crisis happened. They weren't the protagonist of their parents' struggle around mom and dad lost their jobs, or retirement planning, or, you know, grandma and grandpa had to move in with us, or whatever that is. But they felt all of the downstream ripple effects of that. And so they can authentically tell a story, even though they were not part of the first wave of the waterfall where all of those implications were happening. Though the emotional impact could be very great. And as a client is hearing that, they're thinking, how would my kids experience? I mean, that's one of the questions clients are always asking. How are my kids going to experience our decisions?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because it strikes me we're talking about very human experiences, and you know, we on this podcast we talk a lot about financial services and disruption and how things are going, and I think there's this interesting tie because I'm going to see if I can tie it all together. You've got this idea of like technology is continuing to enable and assist us, and we've got technology literate people increasingly entering the workforce. Second, because of that, we've got all this information flying at people, and they have access to a lot of it. And then third, we have this confusion generally around like, what is it that as an advisor I should be projecting out into the world? And if you think about all we're talking about is the felt needs of real people through real life situations. And yet financial services is just really famous for just bombarding people with facts, figures, charts, graphs, complex stuff, i.e. stuff that bores me, makes me go to sleep, makes me feel stupid, makes me not really feel connected, versus all the stuff we're talking about is the stuff of like, how do you actually bring your heart to the business and create this human connection? And so, it's interesting, even as we were thinking about this call and this topic, which is more even cerebral in the sense of, how do you appeal to people? There was this question around how much should we talk about in this show about, like how to deal with compliance and all of the stuff and regulations, and people want to approve stuff. And when what the SEC and FINRA and all these regulatory bodies are concerned about, they're concerned about misinforming the public on different issues related to those facts and figures, and misguiding them. Nobody said from a regulatory perspective that they were worried about misinforming the public around how people really feel and how they line their purpose up with their money choices, and all of these very human things that we experience, that we just happen to use this tool we call money to actually help us achieve something, or on the other hand, it becomes a barrier for us to be able to achieve something that calls to us. So I think it's interesting, and I think that's where, when we think about getting outside of our own box and thinking about talking to people that deal with marketing in a much more, I would say, connected human engagement way. I mean, I think that's all about what we're trying to do on this show. I wonder if you have any comments on how you think through that and how you help your clients think through that, because I think it's very extendable to financial services in a very approachable way. In fact, that gets over some of these natural barriers that a lot of people feel in their day to day.
Yeah. So so two things. One of our big beliefs is that people buy from people, not companies. And so in professional services, it's like I may work for Deloitte, but I'm buying from Paul or Todd or whomever. And people want to buy from people that they like. And so when we talk about our kind of process for point of view, we have 4 elements in the point of view framework. It is, clarity in who you serve. So getting real dialed in on your ICP. Second is I call it your unified theory. It's like what you believe to be true about your domain. And ideally it's somewhat differentiated such that you can swap. If you swap my logo in from another logo, they're going to be like, oh, that doesn't really make sense anymore. That's kind of the target. So like Manifold, as an example, again, the narrative that we had the most success with was we realized that one thing that the Deloittes of the world can't say is that they ran a venture fund or that they were operators inside of startups. And so our innovation approach became everything was about learn from the best innovators in the world are in Silicon Valley, and it's the entrepreneurs and it's the people who back them. And so you as a company are effectively backing your internal entrepreneurs. And so what does that look like? And so we talked about governance and spreading your bets across a bunch of things and using stage gate criteria that look similar to like a seed, Series A, et cetera. That was language that gave us some differentiation that other firms couldn't say. So that was number 2. But number 3, which I think you're hitting on and is super important, is the values, is like our reason for being. And I, not to get like woo woo about it, but like one of the things I say often is that like I'm building a story with my life, and my work is a big part of that. Like I spend more of my waking hours working than anything else. And so I want that to contribute meaningfully to the story that I'm trying to create. And good stories point to something, like they have a theme, like they're about something. And I think my values are an opportunity for me, if I clarify them in as powerful language as I possibly can, and if I articulate what I mean, what I do and do not do as a result of having that value in terms of how I show up professionally. One, that's an opportunity for me to show up again with a lot of authenticity and in a way that I think makes any job kind of worthwhile. But 2, I think it can be really appealing and winsome to a certain type of audience. And so like, for example, for Madison, 2 of our values are around service and craft. And so the way I describe craft is like when I'm sitting down and I'm writing a LinkedIn post or working on a webinar or whatever for a client, this is going to be the best one I've ever done. And like, that's the frame of mind I try to put myself in. And there is a forced humility in that I think is inherent in professional services. It's like we literally exist to serve. That's the only reason why we're around. And if I can show up that way, and if I can signal to my clients that I show up that way, it feels they feel something, and it makes them more likely to want to work with me, not less. And so you can do that at an entity level. I think you can codify a lot of that in terms of how you show up as an organization, but then at an individual level too. I did a personal branding workshop this morning for a growth consultancy out in New York, and it was they did the point of view for the company, and then we did the point of view for the individuals, and we said there's a then there. Hopefully there's some overlap between your values and the organization's values, but you also have your own. And it's like, tap into your why. And like the example of the kid who went through that, like their why could be, I saw the stress that created for my family. I remember how it felt in my body to be in that household. And thankfully they recovered and we survived and all of that. But like, I decided at a really early age that like, I never want to experience that again. And then as an adult, when I was thinking about what I do, I don't want anybody else to experience that. And so I've kind of made it my life's work to set other families up where they can weather storms like that. Like they can thrive when things are going great, and they can weather storms when things aren't going great. And that's that's why I do this. Like that would be, I would imagine, a pretty compelling story to a certain group of people that isn't, I have 50 years of experience. It's authentic to who they are, but still is like taps into something kind of deep, So.
Yeah, it's you made me think of it's probably I would put it on my best post ever. I have a lot of dumb posts too, so let's be clear.
Join the club.
And this was more serendipitous, but one of the things personally that I really want to leave the industry being known for is leadership development. And it's all about, one of the big reasons I chose to be at 49, because that's what we're all about, is next generation of leaders, and an industry that deserves that, needs to be revolutionized by that. And we want to be a part of that. But I found myself, maybe it was a year or so ago, I created a post where my daughter was elected to the student council. She was 9, 10 at the time. And it was just I think this is very unintentional. So I make this sound like this was very, like I've hired a really snazzy consulting firm, and they've coached me on this, like Sean. And I just put, like, I love doing this in the workplace and seeing people advance, and at home, it's just a proud dad moment of seeing my daughter really put herself in the leadership position at a really young age, and just really wanted to hold it out there to the world. I mean, like, this was one of the ones where I got rando people giving me comments, so second, third, 8th degree connections, saying, like, this is super cool. And I'm thinking, I've tried so hard on some of my other stuff to get people's attention, and then I just did something that really was on my heart, and it actually worked.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard though to manufacture that authentically. But I think it's, it seems to me to be a trained skill to actually think about that and to project that in a way that does bring that level of impact, but does it consistently. And so I hope, for those listening, that they're thinking about what, again, back to that human side, like what's really calling to you in this moment. I think that your comment, Sean, might have sparked something in somebody that thought, like, this was my moment of serendipity that I want to recreate, that I want to actually put some structure around.
Yeah.
I think that could be a pretty good place to wrap. We've talked about kind of the finding your voice, the 4 elements of that, Sean. I know all of that is on your website and much more.
Sure.
For people that are wanting to continue to think through this journey, go down this journey, and then start finding their voice and sharing their voice more authentically with their ideal client profile, how would they learn more from you, and what would be your recommendations on next steps?
Yeah.
Sure.
Before you answer, Sean, I mean, I didn't realize that this was a coaching session for me, so thank you. So, Dan, you could have been just more sincere about it. I didn't know that that's why we got Sean on, and now we're going to share this with people. So
Well, 35 minutes in, Luke, this is your intervention.
Yeah, I get it now. Okay, it clicked. This was the grand the resolution to the story of which I'm the protagonist. Okay, go ahead, Sean. Sorry.
Love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, learning more. Obviously, you mentioned the website, Founder of Madison. I'm trying to add to that, progressively over time in a systematic way. I call it playbook, so it's trying to be an order of operations. Or just follow me on LinkedIn. I post 3 or 4 times a week about all this stuff, and I try to model kind of the things that I'm talking about. So it's a little bit inception-y. But I guess my admonition for people, or my recommendation for people, would be take a long view. Don't worry or obsess about how any individual one post does. I feel like as long as you're adding value, you've done your job. Like, you've shown up and you've served your audience that day. I would encourage people that you have time to find your voice too. Like, the worst case scenario is that a post doesn't resonate with somebody. They just keep scrolling. Like, it's the risk is so low. And so, it's like a muscle, like anything else, and just, practice. And I just believe if you get really clear on who you're trying to serve, and if you show up authentically and regularly and try to add value with every single post, and that could be practical advice, that could be some of the stuff that we've talked about that kind of tap more into the story and the personal side of things. If you do it consistently and just add time to it, people will raise their hands. And it's just a really fun way to show up in life too. I guess the last thing would be for people, especially like younger people, or maybe people who don't have 30 years of experience or whatever. A really useful framing for me has also been, what would 5 years ago me wish I knew? Because I'm certain that anybody would have, their own version of that. And that can be a really useful way to just kind of exercise the muscle of like, and eventually once you start doing it and once you build a muscle, you see it everywhere. Like, every single client conversation, you're like, oh, that's an interesting question. I bet other people have that question. Or every internal meeting, or, every article that you read, like your antenna goes up for this, and, life starts to get pretty fun. And it's not about trying to be an influencer or anything like that. It's as long as your heart is about serving people, it makes it really exciting, because it's a mechanism for serving people at scale. Some of whom may become your clients someday, many of whom won't, but they still will be benefiting by, being in their lives in some way. And so those would be kind of my encouragements.
Thank you for joining us, Sean. And thank you all for listening to The Tension.